The first thing Deshawn remembered was the scream, sharp, high, and terrifyingly real. It wasn't Savannah's usual squeal of laughter. It was the kind of scream that froze blood. By the time he dropped his coffee mug and bolted down the porch steps, she was already on the ground, her tiny frame twisted awkwardly beside the sidewalk, her walker tipped over like a broken branch. Blood pooled beneath her hip. Her hands were shaking, her face was pale, and Ranger, sweet, loyal Ranger, was barking in circles around her, panicked and frenzied, the leash dragging behind him as if he'd tried to shield her and failed. Deshawn hit his knees so hard they cracked against the concrete. "Savannah? Baby, talk to me, where are you hurt?" She whimpered, one hand clutching her side, blood soaking through the soft blue cotton of her favorite hoodie. "It hurts, Daddy," she whispered, eyes wide and unfocused. His brain was screaming for clarity, but his hands moved on instinct, applying pressure to the wound, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. Somewhere behind him, a voice rang out. Shrill, defensive. I was aiming at the dog. It was Karen Belmont, still standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, still holding the gun that had just discharged, smoke curling up from the barrel like the stench of something evil. Her face was tight, with indignation, not remorse. "I warned you people, those animals don't belong here." Sirens howled in the distance. Neighbors peeked from windows, but didn't come out. Ranger whined and pressed himself against Savannah's side as Deshawn screamed for help. Time warped. Seconds stretched into lifetimes. The ambulance finally arrived, lights flashing across brick driveways and beige garage doors. Paramedics lifted Savannah onto a gurney, stabilizing her bleeding hip, her fragile legs. One turned to Deshawn and said, "It missed the bone." But barely. Deshawn couldn't breathe. He looked at Karen, arms folded, gun now hidden from sight, as she muttered something about property safety. A police officer approached her, not in handcuffs, but with a clipboard. Deshawn stared, stunned. "She just shot my daughter, and she's not even being arrested." As the ambulance doors slammed shut, and he climbed inside, clutching Savannah's hand with one and gripping Ranger's leash with the other, Deshawn finally let the rage surface, hot, bitter, volcanic. He looked through the ambulance window, eyes locked on Karen's unbothered face. And in voiceover, the words he never thought he'd say, she said she was protecting the neighborhood, but she almost ended my daughter's life. Savannah came into the world fighting. Born 8 weeks early after a difficult pregnancy, she weighed less than 4 pounds and spent her first few weeks beneath a tangle of tubes and monitors in the NICU. Deshawn had stood by her incubator every night, whispering promises through the plastic that he would protect her, that he would never leave, that she would never feel alone in the world. When his wife passed away from a stroke just months after Savannah's birth, those promises became the foundation of his entire existence. He was a single father now, and Savannah was everything. She was diagnosed with cerebral palsy at age 2. Doctors explained it gently. Her motor function would be limited, her balance unsteady, her muscles stiff and unpredictable. They handed him medical brochures and warned him of milestones that might never come. But Savannah defied them all. She walked, slowly with braces, and later a walker, but she walked. She laughed. She painted with her fingers, played piano with 2 wobbly hands, and danced in circles in their living room to music only she could hear. She was joy in motion, wrapped in vulnerability and stubborn will. Deshawn called her his sunbeam with thunder behind her eyes. Still, there were bad days. Her legs would give out without warning. Bright lights and loud noises overwhelmed her. Crowds made her anxious. When she was 6, she began having panic attacks at school, tight chest, shallow breaths, unable to speak. A school counselor suggested a therapy animal. Deshawn was hesitant at first, but when he met Ranger, all hesitation melted. The golden retriever had a calmness about him that was almost human. When Savannah met him, she simply laid her hand on his back and smiled. A smile that hadn't been there in weeks. That night, she slept through the entire night for the first time in months. Ranger was more than a dog. He was a shadow, a guardian, a silent therapist. He nudged Savannah to take deep breaths during meltdowns, stood steady as she used him for balance, and lay beside her during leg spasms, his head resting on her lap. When she was with Ranger, Savannah didn't feel broken. She felt normal. By the time she turned 10, Deshawn felt like they were finally settling into something that resembled peace. That's why he chose Willow Ridge. The brochures boasted wide sidewalks, quiet streets, and a family-first HOA community. Deshawn used every penny of his savings to move them into a modest single-story home on Magnolia Lane. It wasn't big, but it had a yard, a porch swing, and enough space for Savannah to stretch her legs and Ranger to roam safely. The community seemed calm, well-kept. Neighbors waved. The HOA's policies were strict, but Deshawn didn't mind. Rules meant structure, and he'd had enough chaos for a lifetime. At first, Willow Ridge felt like exactly what they needed. Savannah loved the open cul-de-sac where she could practice walking without fear of traffic. She loved the garden at the end of the block and would collect leaves with Ranger beside her, naming each one like they were friends. He would trot along beside her walker, occasionally stopping to lick her hand or nuzzle her when she paused to rest. Deshawn would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching them, heart full. He truly believed they had found safety. That maybe, for once, the world would stop trying to break them. But he hadn't met Karen Belmont yet. Not really. He'd seen her, of course, pressed polo shirts, clipboard always in hand, walking the neighborhood like a warden on patrol. She'd waved politely. Once, she even complimented his lawn. But there was something in her eyes. A measuring look. Cold. Empty. The kind of gaze that didn't see a family, only in fractions. The complaint started small. A printed warning on his door. Dogs must remain on designated paths. Please avoid walking on HOA-maintained lawns. Then an email. Some residents are uncomfortable with large dogs near children. Consider using alternate routes. Deshawn replied, explaining Ranger's certification. Karen responded curtly, therapy status does not exempt from HOA safety standards. Still, he tried to keep the peace. He never imagined she would escalate it. Not until the day she raised a gun and his daughter fell to the ground. Karen Belmont had lived in Willow Ridge for over a decade, and from the moment Deshawn moved in, it was clear she considered herself the unofficial gatekeeper of the neighborhood. She wasn't on the HOA board by title alone. She held the position of community safety chair, a role that gave her just enough authority to feel important and just enough access to make life miserable for anyone she deemed out of compliance. She wasn't loud. She didn't yell. But her presence was everywhere, an email here, a complaint there, a folded arms stare from her porch. She patrolled the streets at sunrise and again after sunset, clipboard in one hand, leash-free purse dog in the other. A white, trembling poodle named Bentley who barked at everything but whom Karen referred to as the most disciplined soul in the Ridge. Deshawn first crossed paths with her during his second week in the neighborhood. He was helping Savannah practice walking to the community mailbox while Ranger walked beside her, calm and leashed. Karen had appeared from nowhere, offering a tight smile and a flat greeting. Her eyes fixated on Ranger. He's quite large, isn't he? She said. You know, some of our residents are terrified of big breeds. We've had incidents. Deshawn calmly explained that Ranger was a certified therapy dog, trained and gentle. Karen nodded, but it was the kind of nod that meant I don't care. That same evening, he received an email. Subject, animal concern. The message was short and clinical. Resident reports of an uncomfortably large dog near the shared mail area. While we understand this is a support animal, please consider alternate walking paths to avoid alarming residents. He let it go, but the warnings escalated. One day it was, your dog's leash appears longer than HOA guidelines allow. Another, dog was seen sniffing the shared flower beds. Please respect HOA landscaping. And once, a child reported that your dog stared at their cat in an intimidating manner. It would have been laughable if it weren't so persistent. Rosa, a neighbor who often walked past with her twin toddlers, whispered one day, Karen says your dog's aggressive, that he lunged at someone. I knew it was ridiculous, but just a heads up. Deshawn's stomach sank. It wasn't just policy now. Karen was starting a rumor campaign, painting Ranger as dangerous, planting fear. Karen filed 17 complaints to the HOA in the span of 2 months, all centered on Ranger. Deshawn requested a mediation meeting. Karen declined, citing an unsafe environment. He submitted documentation, Ranger's therapy certification, letters from Savannah's doctors, even a signed statement from a neighbor who had never seen Ranger act out. Karen responded with a formal HOA safety bulletin. Residents are reminded that large dogs, even those claimed as emotional support animals, can still pose a risk. Our neighborhood is not a testing ground for behavioral unpredictability. For the safety of all, report unauthorized animal behavior immediately. She didn't say his name, but she didn't have to. The implication was clear: Ranger didn't belong, and by extension, neither did Savannah. From that moment on, Deshawn watched her more closely. How she always seemed to be nearby when Savannah and Ranger were outside. How she would stop her car mid-street and just watch. He began to keep a log of every encounter, every sideways glance. Something in her eyes wasn't just strict, it was unhinged, controlled, cold. He just never imagined that her obsession with rules would one day lead her to load a weapon, take aim, and pull the trigger. It was a peaceful morning, the kind of quiet that made Willow Ridge seem like the safe haven Deshawn had always hoped it would be. The sun hung low, casting long golden stripes across the sidewalks. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, and birds chirped in lazy rhythms. Deshawn sat on the porch steps, a mug of coffee in one hand and a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he watched his daughter and her dog play. Savannah, dressed in her favorite lavender hoodie and polka-dot leggings, was positioned a few feet down the driveway with her walker. Ranger stood, alert, tail wagging, a bright orange tennis ball between his teeth. With a small grunt of effort, Savannah flung the ball a few yards. It didn't go far, but Ranger darted after it with theatrical enthusiasm, snagged it, and returned, placing it gently into Savannah's outstretched hand. She giggled, a real, full laugh, and Deshawn's heart swelled. These were the moments that made all the battles worth it. Ranger sat patiently as Savannah dropped the ball again and shuffled forward a few steps. Her legs trembled, but Ranger moved beside her, matching her pace, brushing lightly against her walker like a silent coach. When Savannah tripped slightly and dropped into a seated position on the soft grass, Ranger immediately trotted over, licked her cheek, and lay beside her. She laughed again and threw her arms around his neck. "Good boy, Ranger," she whispered, and Deshawn could hear it from the porch. He thought about grabbing his phone to record the moment. Instead, he just watched, soaking it in. And then the front door across the street slammed open. Karen Belmont. She stormed down her driveway like a thundercloud in human form, clipboard swinging at her side. Her eyes locked on Savannah and Ranger with laser precision. "That dog is off-leash," she shouted from halfway across the street. Deshawn stood immediately. "No, ma'am, he's leashed," he called back. And he was. The leash was clipped securely to Ranger's harness, looped around Savannah's walker handle the way it always was. Karen ignored him and kept marching. "This is the third time, this week, I've seen that animal wandering. You think your little therapy certificate excuses you from rules? Karen, please, he's under control. He's with Savannah." "You've seen this 100 times," Deshawn said, trying to stay calm. "They're on our property." She scoffed. "Property lines mean nothing when your dog is putting the entire street at risk." Savannah looked confused, shrinking a little into Ranger's side. Ranger didn't bark, didn't growl, just sat still, head tilted, sensing the rising tension. Deshawn stepped off the porch, hands raised in peace. He's doing his job. Savannah's safe. Let's not make this something it isn't. Karen stopped at the edge of her lawn, her expression hard. "I've had enough of that mutt," she muttered, her voice low and sharp. "Enough of all this." Then she turned abruptly and stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard a nearby wind chime fell silent. Deshawn stood there for a moment, pulse racing. He looked at Savannah, still sitting in the grass, unaware of how quickly the air had changed. He exhaled slowly, brushing it off as another bad encounter. Another line crossed by a woman obsessed with control. But he didn't know. He didn't know that behind that door, Karen Belmont wasn't calming down. She was unlocking a drawer and loading her gun. The morning had been peaceful, the kind of peace that felt earned. Like maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind them. Deshawn had just turned to head inside to refill his coffee when it happened. Crack! The sound split the air like lightning on dry pavement. It wasn't a car backfiring. It wasn't fireworks. It was sharp, sudden, and unmistakable. A gunshot. Time froze. Ranger let out a piercing yelp and bolted. Savannah screamed, a scream that ripped through the stillness like a knife, and collapsed to the ground, her walker clattering sideways. Deshawn's coffee mug shattered against the concrete as he sprinted toward her, his body moving before his brain could catch up. She was curled on her side, one hand outstretched toward Ranger, the other clutching her stomach. Blood was already soaking through her hoodie, pooling rapidly beneath her on the pavement. Her face was pale, contorted in pain, eyes wide and panicked. Savannah! Deshawn dropped to his knees beside her. Sweetheart, where are you hit? Talk to me, baby. She tried to speak, but choked instead, her tiny body trembling uncontrollably. Deshawn pulled her hands away and saw the wound, just above her hip, bleeding fast, pulsing red. He tore off his sweatshirt and pressed it hard against the spot, his hands shaking, his voice cracking. Stay with me. I got you. I got you. Then he heard her. Karen, still standing on her front lawn, both hands wrapped around a small black handgun. Her arms were trembling now, but her face wasn't horrified, it was stunned, like she had been the one wronged. I didn't mean, she stammered, eyes darting between Deshawn and Savannah. It was supposed to scare the dog. The words echoed, absurd and cruel. It was supposed to scare the dog? Deshawn's head snapped up. You shot my daughter, he roared, voice hoarse with rage and disbelief. You pointed a gun at a child. Karen stepped back, her grip on the gun tightening before she remembered herself and quickly set it down on the grass. I thought he was charging, she muttered. I thought. He looked aggressive. He was leashed. Deshawn shouted. He was sitting next to her. Ranger had returned by then, crawling low to the ground, tail tucked, eyes locked on Savannah. He whimpered as he nudged her arm, licking her trembling fingers. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the sound, the scream, the rising chaos. Phones came out. Someone called 911. Another knelt nearby, with a towel. But all Deshawn could focus on was the fading color in his daughter's face. The sirens were faint at first, then louder, piercing. Within minutes, paramedics were rushing toward them, stretching Deshawn back as they stabilized Savannah, cutting open her hoodie, applying pressure, starting IVs. He stumbled to his feet, covered in his daughter's blood, staring across the street. Karen stood like a statue. A police officer arrived, walked directly to her, and began asking questions. No handcuffs, no orders to get on the ground, just a notepad and a calm tone. She discharged a firearm in a residential neighborhood. Deshawn shouted. She hit a 10-year-old girl. She says it was accidental, the officer replied, barely glancing his way. We're gathering statements. That's my daughter, Deshawn hissed, and she could be dying. The officer didn't answer. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and Deshawn jumped inside just as they pulled away, clutching Savannah's hand with one and Ranger's leash with the other. Her blood was still on his jeans. Her voice echoed in his ears. Daddy, it hurts. He held her tightly and whispered, I'm here. I've got you. But as the ambulance raced through red lights and city streets, one thought kept circling in his mind. This wasn't a mistake. It was a warning shot, and it hit the wrong target. The waiting room was too white, too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes every breath sound like thunder and every second stretch like an hour. Deshawn sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, Savannah's blood still, drying on his jeans. His hands, trembling and red, gripped the edge of the vinyl seat, so tightly his knuckles had turned bone white. The doors to surgery had closed 20 minutes ago, and still no word. Ranger lay on the floor beside him, his head resting near Deshawn's boot, not moving, not making a sound. The once playful, comforting dog was still as stone, haunted by the pain and panic he couldn't stop. A nurse had tried to move him. Ranger had growled, low, not aggressive, but firm, protective. They let him stay. A doctor finally emerged, calm, tired, gloved hands streaked with red. "Mr. Harris?" she said. Deshawn stood so quickly his chair skidded behind him. "She's stable," the doctor said, gently. "The bullet missed her spine by less than an inch. We managed to stop the bleeding. No organs were severely damaged, but there was muscle and nerve trauma in her hip and lower abdomen. She'll recover, but the damage to her right leg may impact her mobility further." Deshawn exhaled shakily, hands on his head. "But she's going to live?" "She's going to live," the doctor confirmed with a soft nod. "She'll be groggy for a while. You can see her soon." He dropped back into the chair, face buried in his palms, shoulders shaking. She was alive, but she had been shot. Shot by a neighbor. By a woman who was still sitting comfortably in her home across the street. The police came to the hospital 2 hours later. Not in a rush. Not with urgency. 2 uniformed officers and a clipboard. They asked Deshawn to recount what happened. He told them every word, every detail. How Savannah had been playing fetch with her therapy dog. How the dog had been leashed. How Karen had screamed threats for weeks. How she walked back inside her house and minutes later, a shot. "Did you see the gun before the discharge?" one officer asked, as if Deshawn might have imagined it. "She was holding it," Deshawn said through clenched teeth. She admitted she was aiming at the dog. The officer scribbled a few notes, then said, "We've spoken with Ms. Belmont. She says it was a warning shot, that she didn't intend to hit anyone, that the firearm discharged prematurely." "Prematurely?" Deshawn repeated, stunned. "You mean accidentally?" The officer nodded. "It'll be classified as an accidental discharge unless we find evidence of intent. No arrest. We're still reviewing." Deshawn wanted to scream, but Savannah was sleeping in the next room, so he didn't. Later that night, he stood by her bedside, Ranger curled up near her feet. Her face was pale, lips dry, but her hand gripped his finger with surprising strength. Deshawn leaned close and whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't protect you." She didn't reply. She didn't have to. The tears came anyway. Deshawn hadn't slept more than 2 hours since the shooting. He stayed by Savannah's hospital bed during the day and sat at the kitchen table all night, surrounded by piles of documents, emails, and printed screenshots. Rage didn't fuel him anymore. Resolve did. His daughter had been shot. Shot. And the woman responsible had walked back into her house, free to water her lawn and write her newsletters as if nothing had happened. He started by digging through his HOA emails, every single one that mentioned Ranger. There were more than he remembered, every notice, every veiled threat. Some of them were comically petty. Dog spotted too close to mailbox. Dog sniffed rose bush. But some were deeply disturbing. One read, "This dog exhibits predatory behavior. Its presence is unsettling. I feel unsafe walking past their property. Something must be done." It was signed by Karen Belmont. The date? 3 days before the shooting. He began organizing them, highlighting language. The patterns were clear. Karen had been building a paper trail, a fake one, setting the stage to justify an escalation. Then came the bombshell. Rosa, his kind neighbor who had always smiled at Savannah, knocked gently on his door 2 nights after Savannah's second surgery. In her hand was a flash drive. "I have something," she said. "I didn't want to get involved before, but this crossed the line." It was her doorbell camera footage. Karen, walking up the sidewalk 3 minutes before the shot was fired. Karen, pulling a small handgun from her purse, tucking it beneath her sweater as she crossed her yard. Karen, pausing just for a second before walking out of frame. Deshawn watched it 10 times. His hands trembled the same way they had when the paramedics loaded Savannah into the ambulance. It wasn't an accident. She hadn't grabbed it in fear. She planned it. The next morning, he walked into a civil rights attorney's office with a flash drive, a binder of HOA documentation, and a tear-stained picture of Savannah holding Ranger before the shooting. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Trina Brooks, listened without interrupting. When he finished, she leaned back and said, "This isn't just civil negligence. This is criminal endangerment, and depending on the prosecutor, attempted manslaughter." Deshawn stared. "Then let's file everything." They did. A civil lawsuit for damages, emotional distress, assault, and medical expenses. They filed with the city prosecutor's office, demanding that felony charges be brought. Trina also filed complaints with the Department of Justice Disability Rights section, citing harassment and discrimination. She even sent the footage to local media anonymously. Within days, things changed. The footage leaked. News headlines exploded. HOA board member caught on video moments before shooting 10-year-old disabled girl. Public outrage flooded the HOA's inbox. Protest signs went up at the entrance of Willow Ridge. A gun is not code enforcement. Justice for Savannah. Therapy dogs don't kill, paranoia does. And the real story began to surface. Karen had filed 17 official HOA complaints against Deshawn's family, more than any other resident. None of them had led to fines. None had been substantiated. But they painted a narrative. That Deshawn was negligent, that Ranger was dangerous, that Savannah's condition made her unpredictable. The most chilling complaint read, "This child's behavior cannot be trusted. Her presence alone makes it difficult to distinguish a real emergency from a meltdown." That was the moment Deshawn knew. She wasn't just trying to get rid of the dog. She was trying to erase the entire family. The final straw came when Karen's attorney sent a letter requesting mediation to avoid further public damage. Trina crumpled it and tossed it aside. "No, we don't settle silence." Deshawn sat beside Savannah that night, her small fingers curled around his. Ranger lay at her feet. Her leg was bandaged, her face still pale. But her eyes were open, watching, waiting. And Deshawn made her one more promise. No more hiding. No more backing down. We fight this. All the way. It didn't take long before the story became national news. What started as a local headline, HOA board member shoots child, claims mistake, exploded across social media after the leaked footage aired. The images were damning. Karen Belmont approaching with a concealed weapon, Deshawn's 10-year-old daughter playing with a therapy dog, then the scream, the sirens, the blood. The footage went viral within hours. News anchors repeated Karen's words in disbelief. "I was aiming at the dog." The internet was furious. Hashtags lit up Twitter and TikTok. Hashtag Justice for Savannah. Hashtag Therapy Dogs Are Not Threats. And hashtag HOA Karen trended nationwide. Thousands of people shared their own stories of discrimination against their therapy animals or disabled children in rigid neighborhoods like Willow Ridge. One post read, "If your HOA's rules are tighter than your humanity, maybe it's time to rewrite the rules." Photos of Savannah in her hospital bed, smiling weakly with Ranger curled up beside her, flooded the news cycle. People donated to a fundraiser to cover medical costs. It exceeded its goal within 48 hours. Artists created digital portraits of Savannah and Ranger. Defenders called them heroes. And the story wasn't just about a shooting anymore. It was about something deeper. What happens when power, fear, and prejudice masquerade as neighborhood safety? But not everyone in Willow Ridge took the side of justice. Some residents stood behind Karen. They claimed the shooting was an unfortunate misunderstanding. One anonymous letter sent to the HOA said, "It's tragic, but we've had concerns about that dog for months. Karen was only trying to keep us safe." Others blamed Deshawn for overexposing the issue and bringing negative attention to the community. The neighborhood was split, fractured between those who wanted accountability and those who wanted quiet. But the pressure from the outside world couldn't be ignored. Protesters appeared outside HOA meetings with signs and bullhorns. Local activists called for new board elections and immediate legal reform. The media parked vans outside Willow Ridge for days, recording community members ducking behind hedges or driving past with tinted windows. The story refused to die, because Savannah refused to be forgotten. Finally, the HOA cracked. In an emergency session, the board voted unanimously to remove Karen Belmont from all committee positions, citing reckless behavior and conduct unbecoming of a board member. They released a formal statement. Willow Ridge HOA deeply regrets the events surrounding the recent incident and pledges to create a safer, more inclusive neighborhood moving forward. They also announced a community safety reform summit, inviting legal experts, disability rights advocates, and residents to overhaul enforcement policies. It was a start, but for Deshawn, it wasn't about press releases or public relations. It was about accountability, about a little girl in a hospital bed who hadn't asked for a fight, only for space to play with her dog in peace. And that fight wasn't over yet. Savannah's recovery was slow, but determined, just like everything else about her. Weeks passed, the stitches healed, the bruises faded, physical therapy began. Her therapists adjusted her routines to account for the nerve damage in her right leg, and at first, every step was agony. But Savannah never gave up. Not once. Ranger walked beside her every session, steady and loyal. Sometimes she held his harness instead of the walker. Sometimes she leaned into his soft, golden fur and just breathed. Deshawn watched her grow stronger every day, not just in body, but in spirit. And as she did, the world around them began to change. The lawsuit moved forward. Karen faced mounting legal pressure from both civil court and the ADA complaint filed through the Department of Justice. The evidence, the emails, the video footage, the 17 false complaints was too much to bury. Though criminal charges were still under review, the city issued a restraining order permanently barring Karen from any leadership roles in community housing or local governance. Her house went up for sale quietly. A for sale sign stood on her once manicured lawn for weeks, collecting dust and side eyes. Meanwhile, the HOA's Community Safety Reform Summit turned into something real. Not a token gesture, but a sweeping policy overhaul. Deshawn, at first reluctant, agreed to serve as an advisor. So did a therapist from Savannah's clinic and two parents of disabled children. Together, they helped rewrite decades of exclusionary rules. Gone were the vague codes about aesthetic harmony and emotional discomfort caused by animals. In their place, clear protections for therapy animals, disability accommodations, and anti-discrimination enforcement. The neighborhood newsletter now had a new tagline, Willow Ridge, where everyone belongs. And they meant it this time. But the most unexpected moment came one Saturday afternoon. The city invited Savannah to a local arts fair, not just to attend, but to unveil something, a mural, painted by a dozen young artists with disabilities. In the center, a large golden retriever standing tall beside a little girl with a lavender hoodie and a walker. Around them swirled bright colors and bold words in sweeping cursive. I am not a threat. I am a child. Savannah stood quietly in front of it, holding Ranger's leash, her smile shy but proud. The mayor handed her a certificate for courage and community leadership. Savannah didn't speak, but she nodded, and that small gesture meant more than any speech ever could. Deshawn knelt beside her and whispered, "You did this. You changed them." Savannah tilted her head. "I just wanted to play with Ranger," she said softly. Deshawn chuckled, voice thick with emotion, "And you made the world safer while doing it." He looked around, at the mural, at the smiling families at the new Willow Ridge, and for the first time in a long time, he exhaled. They had survived the shot, but more importantly, they'd built something stronger than fear. Just when Deshawn thought it was over, another envelope arrived, this time hand-delivered and stamped with a private law firm seal. Inside was a new lawsuit. Karen Belmont was suing him for defamation, harassment, and emotional damages caused by viral misrepresentation. The filing claimed Deshawn had incited a targeted campaign that led to the loss of property value and personal distress. He read it twice, then a third time. His hands tightened. Savannah watched him from across the room, quietly sketching Ranger. "Are we okay, Daddy?" she asked. He looked at her, so strong, so alive, and smiled with a calm he hadn't felt before. "We're better than okay," he said. "Now, we finish what we started." Backhand index pointing right, next episode. Karen returns to court, but the truth has more witnesses than she ever expected, including a little girl ready to speak for herself.